It was a bright day when Clint Eastwood arrived at the press event for his latest film. The room buzzed with excitement as reporters from various media outlets gathered, ready to ask their questions. Clint, as always, appeared calm and composed. At 94 years old, he was a Hollywood legend, known for his iconic roles in westerns and his strong, no-nonsense personality both on and off the screen. The reporters waited eagerly for their turn, but one particular liberal reporter seemed different from the rest. His name was David, and he was known for his aggressive style of questioning, particularly when it came to public figures who didn't align with his political views. David had a plan that day to corner Clint Eastwood, to make him feel uncomfortable, and to spark controversy. As the questions began, Clint answered each one with ease, his voice steady and his demeanor unwavering. He spoke about his new movie, his passion for filmmaking, and his career that had spanned more than 6 decades. But David wasn't interested in that. He wanted a headline. He wanted a story that would go viral. When it was finally David's turn, he didn't hesitate. With a smirk on his face, he leaned forward, microphone in hand, and asked, "Mr. Eastwood, some people say your films glorify violence and promote outdated, conservative values. Do you think it's responsible for someone of your influence to push such dangerous messages in today's world?" The room fell silent. Everyone turned to see how Clint would respond to such a loaded question. David's words hung in the air, sharp and accusatory. It was clear that he wanted to provoke Clint, to make him stumble. Clint didn't flinch. He locked eyes with David, his expression calm but firm. The tension in the room was palpable, and everyone waited for Clint's response. Clint took a moment before answering. His silence seemed to stretch on forever, making the tension in the room even thicker. He could feel the eyes of every reporter in the room on him, waiting to see how he would react to the blatant attack. But Clint Eastwood wasn't a man who could be easily rattled. Finally, he spoke, his voice measured and calm. "I've made a lot of films over the years, and they cover a lot of different themes. Some of them deal with violence, sure. But if you really watch them, you'll see that they're about something more than that. They're about the choices people make and the consequences of those choices. That's not a dangerous message. That's reality." David wasn't satisfied. He pressed on, interrupting Clint before he could finish. "But don't you think that in today's society, with all the issues we're facing, your films send the wrong message? Shouldn't you be using your platform to promote more progressive ideas instead of clinging to outdated values?" Clint raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed by the reporter's aggressive tone. He could see what David was trying to do, twist the narrative to fit his own agenda. But Clint wasn't about to let himself be baited into an argument. He had faced tougher challenges than this in his long career, and he wasn't about to back down now. Without missing a beat, Clint replied, "I think people are smart enough to make up their own minds about what they watch. I'm not here to tell anyone what to believe. My job is to tell stories. If people take something from those stories, that's up to them." The room remained silent, but the tension was building. The other reporters could sense that something was about to happen. David, however, wasn't ready to give up. He wanted a reaction from Clint, something he could use to make headlines. And so, he pushed harder. David leaned forward, his voice growing louder as he continued his attack. "Isn't it irresponsible, though, to ignore the power you have as a filmmaker? Don't you think it's time to stop glorifying violence and start promoting more inclusive, progressive values? The world is changing, Mr. Eastwood. Maybe it's time you changed with it." Clint remained calm, but his eyes narrowed slightly. He could feel the pressure mounting, but he wasn't going to let this reporter get the best of him. He knew what David was trying to do, and he wasn't going to play along. Instead of reacting with anger, Clint simply smiled. It was a small smile, barely noticeable, but it was enough to signal that he was still in control of the situation. "I've always believed that people should be free to tell the stories they want to tell," he said. "If you don't like the stories I tell, that's fine. You're free to make your own movies and tell your own stories. David frowned, clearly frustrated that Clint wasn't rising to the bait. He wanted a confrontation, but Clint wasn't giving him one. Instead, Clint was handling the situation with the same calm confidence that had made him a Hollywood legend. But David wasn't ready to back down. He leaned in even closer, his voice dripping with sarcasm. So you don't think you have any responsibility at all for the messages you're sending? You're just making movies, and that's it? Clint's smile faded, and he leaned forward slightly, meeting David's gaze with a steely look. The room was so quiet that you could hear a pin drop. Every reporter in the room was holding their breath, waiting to see what Clint would do next. Clint paused for a moment, his eyes locked on David. Then, in a calm but firm voice, he replied, "You know, it's easy to sit there and criticize from the sidelines. But it's a lot harder to actually go out there and make something. I've spent my entire life telling stories that matter to me. If you don't like them, that's your opinion. But don't sit there and tell me what I should or shouldn't do." David blinked, clearly caught off guard by Clint's response. He had expected Clint to get defensive, maybe even angry, but instead, Clint had turned the tables on him. The other reporters in the room were watching closely, some of them even nodding in agreement with Clint's words. Clint continued, his voice steady but with an edge of steel. "I've been in this business for a long time and I've seen a lot of people come and go. But one thing I've learned is that you can't please everyone. You have to stay true to yourself, and that's what I've always done. If that bothers you, that's your problem, not mine." David opened his mouth to respond, but Clint wasn't finished. "And as for responsibility," Clint said, his voice growing slightly firmer, "I think it's more irresponsible to try to silence people just because you don't agree with them. If you want to have a conversation, we can do that. But if you're just here to attack me, then you're wasting your time." The room was silent for a moment, and it was clear that Clint had the upper hand. David, who had come into the interview with the intention of humiliating Clint, now found himself on the defensive. David's face flushed with frustration. He had expected Clint to stumble or get defensive, but instead, the tables had turned, and now he was the one struggling to keep his composure. His plan to humiliate Clint had backfired, and the atmosphere in the room shifted. The other reporters were no longer looking at Clint as the target of David's attack. Instead, their focus was on David, waiting to see how he would recover from this unexpected turn of events. David cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the situation. His voice was less confident now, a slight tremor betraying his frustration. "So, what you're saying is, you don't care about the impact your films have on society? You're saying you're just here to make movies without any regard for the consequences?" Clint remained calm, his eyes never leaving David's. He could sense the younger man's desperation, his need to twist Clint's words into something controversial. But Clint wasn't going to let him do that. "I care about the stories I tell," Clint said, his voice steady. "But I'm not here to push an agenda. My responsibility is to make films that reflect life as I see it. If people see themselves in those stories, if they take something away from them, that's great. But I'm not here to tell anyone how to think. That's not my job, and it's not yours either." David opened his mouth to argue, but Clint cut him off, his voice growing a little sharper now. "You know, it's funny," Clint said, his gaze unwavering. "You talk about responsibility, but you don't seem to take any responsibility for the way you frame your questions. You came here looking for a fight, not a conversation. And that says a lot more about you than it does about me." The room fell silent again. The tension was thick, and David's confidence was rapidly crumbling. He had come in expecting to outsmart a Hollywood legend, but now he was the one being schooled. The other reporters exchanged glances, some of them nodding subtly, as if to say Clint was right. David tried one last time, his voice faltering as he spoke. "But don't you think," before he could finish, Clint leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but carrying the weight of his decades of experience. "No, I don't think," he interrupted, his tone final. "I know. I've been in this business long enough to know that people are smart enough to make up their own mind. And that's the only thing that matters." David sat back in his chair, clearly defeated. His attempts to humiliate Clint had not only failed, but they had backfired spectacularly. Clint had not only defended himself with grace and dignity, but he had also exposed David's tactics for what they were, an attempt to stir up controversy for the sake of a headline. The silence in the room was deafening. No one else dared to speak, not even David, who seemed to have lost the will to continue his line of questioning. The other reporters, sensing that the confrontation was over, began to shift in their seats, their attention now fully on Clint. Clint, ever the professional, didn't rub his victory in. He simply leaned back in his chair, his expression calm but firm. He had made his point, and there was no need to say anything more. But the damage to David's ego was done. He had walked into the room with the intention of tearing Clint down, of making a name for himself by taking on a Hollywood legend. Instead, he had been humiliated, not by Clint's anger or defensiveness, but by his calm and measured response. As the other reporters began to ask their own questions, David sat quietly, his microphone lowered. The tension in the room had dissipated, and the atmosphere had shifted back to one of professionalism. Clint answered the remaining questions with ease, his focus now fully on his work and the film he had come to promote. But the other reporters couldn't forget what had just happened. Clint's handling of the situation had left a lasting impression, not just on David, but on everyone in the room. It wasn't just his words, it was the way he had remained composed, refusing to be drawn into a petty argument, while still standing his ground and refusing to let David control the narrative. As the press event came to an end, Clint stood up, thanked the reporters for their time, and walked out of the room. David, meanwhile, stayed behind, clearly humiliated and unsure of what to do next. The story of Clint's confrontation with David quickly spread. The press event had been covered by multiple media outlets, and within hours, clips of the exchange began to circulate online. The internet exploded with reactions, most of them in support of Clint. People praised him for his calm demeanor, his refusal to engage in a shouting match, and the way he had dismantled David's aggressive questioning with logic and reason. David, on the other hand, wasn't so lucky. His reputation took a hit as people began to see through his tactic. He had come to the press event with the goal of making Clint look bad, but in the end, he had only succeeded in embarrassing himself. Social media was flooded with comments praising Clint for standing up to the reporter. "Clint Eastwood is a legend," one tweet read. "He handled that reporter like a true professional." Another comment on a popular video clip of the event said, "David thought he could outsmart Clint, but Clint showed him who's boss." As for Clint, he remained as composed as ever. He didn't dwell on the confrontation, nor did he seek out further opportunities to talk about it. For him, it was just another day in the life of a Hollywood icon. He had faced challenges far greater than a tough question from a reporter, and he knew that this, too, would pass. But for David, the incident was a turning point. He realized that his approach to journalism had been wrong. Instead of seeking the truth, he had been looking for conflict, for drama, for a moment that would go viral. And in doing so, he had lost sight of what really mattered, telling the story, not becoming the story. In the end, Clint Eastwood had done what he always did. He stayed true to himself. And in doing so, he had once again proven why he was a Hollywood legend, not just for his work on screen, but for the way he carried himself off-screen as well. Days after the incident, David found himself alone, replaying the confrontation over and over in his mind. The media storm had finally begun to die down, but the weight of what had happened still hung heavy on his shoulders. He could no longer walk into a room without feeling the judgmental stares of his colleagues, who had witnessed his downfall firsthand. The embarrassment wasn't just about his failed attempt to humiliate Clint Eastwood, It was the realization that he had let his ego drive him into a trap of his own making. In chasing the headline, he had forgotten what it meant to be a journalist, to ask questions, not with an agenda, but with the intent to understand, to learn, to get to the truth. Sitting in his small office, David stared at his computer screen, which was filled with articles and clips from the press event. Everywhere he looked, there were headlines about Clint Eastwood's calm and powerful response, while David's name was barely mentioned, except to mock his efforts. "How did I let it come to this?" he thought, rubbing his temples as a sense of regret washed over him. For so long, he had prided himself on being a sharp and fearless journalist, someone who wasn't afraid to ask the tough questions. But now he could see that his questions had been loaded, designed not to uncover the truth but to provoke a reaction, to generate click. David's phone buzzed with a new notification. He hesitated before picking it up, expecting yet another tweet or comment mocking him for his failed attempt. But to his surprise, the message was from one of his former journalism professors. "David," the message read, "I saw what happened with Clint Eastwood. Tough break, but don't let this define you. Remember what I always taught you. It's not about the moment, it's about the story. Learn from this and come back stronger. You're better than this." For the first time since the press event, David felt a glimmer of hope. His professor's words were a reminder that this failure didn't have to be the end of his career. It was a setback, yes, but it was also an opportunity, a chance to reflect on his mistakes and become the kind of journalist he had always aspired to be. As the days went by, David began to rebuild. He started by taking a step back from the fast-paced world of viral news and instead focused on long-form journalism, where he could dig deeper into stories without the pressure of creating controversy. It wasn't easy. The internet's demand for quick, sensational headlines was relentless, but David knew that if he wanted to regain his credibility, he had to stay true to his values. While David worked on rebuilding his career, Clint Eastwood continued to thrive. The press event had only strengthened his already legendary status, with fans and colleagues alike praising him for the way he had handled the confrontation. Clint, however, didn't dwell on the incident. For him, it was just a blip on the radar, a moment in a long career that spanned decades. As he worked on his next film, Clint received numerous letters from fans, many of whom thanked him for his integrity and poise. They admired the way he had stood up for himself without resorting to anger or insults, showing that strength didn't have to come from aggression. Clint read through the letters, grateful for the support, but he remained focused on his work. He had never been one to seek validation from others, and this time was no different. In interviews, Clint was occasionally asked about the confrontation with David, but he always deflected the question, steering the conversation back to his films and the stories he wanted to tell. "It's not about that," Clint would say with a shrug. "I'm just here to make good movies." And so, Clint Eastwood's legacy continued to grow, not just as an actor and director, but as a man who had stood his ground with dignity. His response to David had become part of the Hollywood lore, a reminder that true power lies not in words or insults, but in the quiet strength of someone who knows who they are and what they stand for. Months passed, and David had undergone a transformation, both personally and professionally. He had learned to let go of the need for instant recognition, focusing instead on the stories that mattered. His new work wasn't flashy, but it was honest, and slowly but surely, he began to rebuild his reputation as a journalist. His colleagues noticed the change in him. David was no longer the brash, ego-driven reporter they had once known. He had become more thoughtful, more measured in his approach. He asked questions not to provoke, but to understand, and his interviews reflected a deeper level of insight than ever before. One day, as David was preparing for an interview with a prominent politician, his phone buzzed with an unexpected notification. It was a message from Clint Eastwood's team, inviting him to attend the premiere of Clint's latest film. David was taken aback. He hadn't expected to hear from Clint after what had happened, but the invitation felt like a sign that he was on the right path. At the premiere, David stood among the crowd, watching as Clint made his way down the red carpet. When their eyes met, Clint gave him a nod, a small gesture, but one that spoke volumes. In that moment, David realized that Clint had moved on long ago. The confrontation that had once loomed so large in David's mind was just another moment in the grand scheme of things. David smiled to himself, feeling a sense of closure. He had come full circle, and though the road had been difficult, he was grateful for the lessons he had learned along the way. As Clint walked past, David turned his attention to the big screen, ready to watch the film unfold. The lights dimmed, and as the opening scene played, David couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He had found his way back to what really mattered, the story. And in the end, that was all that mattered.